everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. I'm Zia Mian. I'm the co-director of the Princeton University Program on Science and Global Security and a member of the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our very special webinar today, assessing 80 years of diplomatic efforts for nuclear disarmament, marking the legacy of UN General Assembly Resolution 1. But first, a few words of introduction to the coalition for those who are not already familiar with it. And then I will say a few words about our webinar and introduce our speakers in the order in which they will present. So the Physicists Coalition began work in 2020, and our goal is to reduce the threats from nuclear weapons worldwide by mobilizing advocacy within the physical sciences community in the United States and internationally. Given the civilization-ending potential of the use of nuclear weapons, we advocate for substantive changes in nuclear arsenals, force postures, and declaratory policies. We also call for fulfillment of the long-standing international obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. And you can see more about our work and join the coalition if you're not already a member at our website, physicistcoalition.org. And it's that last part of our mission, calling for fulfillment of the long-standing international obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament, that speaks directly to our webinar today. In June 1945, before the first nuclear weapon had ever been assembled, before the first test, before the first use of nuclear weapons to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and before the first ever threat to use nuclear weapons, which was made by President Truman after the bombing of Hiroshima, some of the physicists and scientists in the US Manhattan Project charged with building America's atomic bomb as part of the Committee on the Social and Political Implications of the Atomic Bomb, chaired by Nobel laureate James Franck, wrote in June 1945 to the US government that the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear power is fraught with infinitely greater dangers than all the inventions of the past. They warned that this new weapon would be a threat not just to the United States, but to all the countries of the world. And they said nations could be diverted from a path which must lead to total mutual destruction by a specific international agreement banning nuclear weapons. So the scientists in the Manhattan Project pointed the way to the need for a global international agreement to ban nuclear weapons at the very onset of the nuclear weapons age. And it is an important part of the historical record that on the 24th of January, 1946, in its very first ever decision, the United Nations General Assembly voted to set up a commission to develop a plan urgently to make recommendations for the elimination of nuclear weapons from national armaments. And the 24th of January 2026 marks the 80th anniversary of this path-breaking resolution that has been a touchstone and guiding star for international nuclear diplomacy, especially in the United Nations system, ever since, in helping countries and civil society focus and keep attention on this oldest unfinished business of the United Nations. So today's webinar will reflect on 8 decades of multilateral efforts to advance nuclear disarmament. And our speakers, we begin with a very special guest. Izumi Nakamitsu is the United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. This makes her the most senior UN official and therefore the most senior person in the international community charged with advancing nuclear disarmament as part of the larger goal to advance disarmament and improve human security. Our second speaker will be Patricia Lewis, who is a physicist and a former director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, as part of a long and distinguished career on using science for advancing nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. Patricia currently is co-chair of the Scientific Advisory Group of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is the most recent international effort to meet the obligations that were first laid out in Resolution 1. Unfortunately, the bad news for today is that our third speaker, Gorka Mukhadzanova, has fallen ill and is not going to be able to join us. So we've had to rearrange the speaking order a little bit. So what we have asked is for the Undersecretary General to make opening remarks, and then there'll be a brief Q&A with her because she has to leave early. And we're very fortunate that Chris King, the chief of the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch in the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, has very kindly agreed at the last minute to stand in for the Undersecretary General for the rest of the webinar and take part in the Q&A at the end of our discussion. So with that, let me hand the webinar over to UN's Undersecretary General Izumi Nakamitsu to make her opening remarks. Izumi, please.
Thank you very much, Zia, and thank you to the coalition. It's so wonderful to be with you via virtual means. I'm actually I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm borrowing a conference room at the NTI, and I'm so sorry I have to leave earlier, but the reason is that I have to go to another event, which is of also important significance. I'll be speaking at the event related to Doomsday Clock, as you know, 85 seconds now. Thank you so much again. It is a very important opportunity to reflect on some of the early histories. Zia mentioned the first UNGA resolution that was adopted on 24th of January. And by the way, there was a commemorative event in London of the first General Assembly meetings where our Secretary General, S.G. Guterres, spoke and referred to the first GA resolution being focused on the nuclear disarmament issues. Now, this GA resolution title is Establishment of a Commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy, as Zia already mentioned. And as a result, UN Atomic Energy Commission was created to achieve a number of goals, most of which will sound familiar to this community, particularly to those of us who work very closely on the NPT issues. Now, they include the exchange between all nations of basic scientific information for peaceful ends, the control of atomic energy to the extent necessary to ensure its use only for peaceful purposes, the implementation of effective safeguards by way of inspection and other means to protect complying states against the hazards of violations and evasions. And finally, one more, the elimination from national armament of atomic weapons and of all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. So in other words, from its very earliest days, and then, we have to remember this was only several months after the shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The UN recognized that nuclear energy and nuclear weapons were unlike anything that had come before, right? They signaled the beginning of a new era in which humanity had invented the power of destroying itself. That was very clear. And in response to that, the member states also recognized the need to abolish nuclear weapons, not as a fringe aspiration, but as embedded into the foundation of the UN as the organization. So I often say that nuclear disarmament and elimination is within our DNA of the United Nations. The GA made clear that humanity's safety depended on preventing nuclear war and advancing nuclear disarmament. Not only that, but that the best and only way to truly prevent nuclear war was to eliminate the weapons themselves. Now, today's meeting serves to commemorate the anniversary of that resolution and the vision of its authors. But Obviously, I cannot do so with a sense of accomplishment and elation. I find myself humbled, really, by how far we have strayed from that vision. 80 years later, nuclear disarmament still eludes us. The past decade or so has been really accelerated erosion of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. We're going backwards. Major powers investing heavily in modernizing nuclear arsenals. So we have to recognize and acknowledge the reality of it as well. Now, in spite of the near misses of the Cold War, and in spite of our understanding of the devastation that a nuclear war would bring, we are somehow going really backwards, and this is part of the reality. We have forgotten, it seems, the lessons of the Cold War. The arms races are destabilizing, that nuclear rhetoric is dangerous, that nuclear weapons do not advance anyone's security, least of all those who possess them. The exceptional progress that has been made to reduce the number and spread of nuclear weapons, preventing nuclear testing that we have achieved in the largely in the past decades, is now really under threat. And the last remaining bilateral arms control agreement, New START, is expiring next week on Thursday. The disarmament and non-proliferation architecture is eroding, and we are entering an era that is more multipolar, more fluid, and more technologically complex, and also very unpredictable these days. For several years, I often warned of the possibility of a new quantitative arms race, but I'm afraid this possibility has become a reality, and this is really a new sort of era that we are or we have entered into. Now, as a result of all these, our shared responsibility to address this danger has never been clearer. So I would like to take this opportunity to touch very briefly on what we in this room, in this virtual room, can do to honor this anniversary and the vision of the first resolution's authors. The first, let us recall that nuclear disarmament is a legal obligation, not an act of charity. We must continue to call upon nuclear weapon states to recommit to their disarmament obligations. The second, we must highlight the importance of preventive nuclear war. While there is little about the Cold War that I would like to relive, or I actually did the security studies during the Cold War. It was a very difficult time, but measures and mechanisms used to remain adaptable for today's notifications for certain activities, enhanced transparency and assurances to non-nuclear weapon states, strengthened crisis communications, restraint in development of new weapon types. All these efforts were made during the Cold War. And while we call for nuclear disarmament, let us also emphasize the need to take concrete, tangible steps to ensure that any of us are around long enough to see it. And then the third, we must rebuild the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. First is, of course, we need to protect it, but we need to also rebuild and strengthen them. And upcoming NPT Review Conference really offers a critical opportunity, I will call it an opportunity, for states to rebuild trust, strengthen commitments, and move decisively back onto the path of nuclear disarmament. The world expects, and we must actually demand, leadership, cooperation, and courage. And that's really an important message that we collectively send. And conversely, none of us can afford a third failed review conference, therefore, and that's, I've been using this word. If that were to happen, of course, the NPT, the treaty itself, would not collapse. But I think that hollowing out of the treaty will probably start, and we must prevent that situation. The fourth, we must continue to emphasize the humanitarian imperative to eliminate nuclear weapons, and I hope Patricia will elaborate on that. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was built on this imperative. That was a very important achievement in recent years. It was also built on the deep frustration, if you will, of many states with the slow pace or the reversal of nuclear disarmament. And it has also brought into focus the issues of nuclear justice, a new concept, and the impact of these weapons on people and environment. By emphasizing these issues, we can ensure that the conversations about nuclear weapons and nuclear policy are not just the providence of the states that possess them, but an issue on which all states have the right and, I emphasize, responsibility to engage in their interest of their own security. And then fifth, we must reject the notion that disarmament requires the right security condition to take place. Disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation are security measures that facilitate conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution. And there are no conditions attached to the Article 6 of the NPT, if I may emphasize. These are a few small suggestions of mine as we look forward, in particular as we intensify our preparations for the review conference of the NPT. But as I thought about this anniversary, I also find it useful to better understand the past as well. So that's why I began by speaking of the UN Atomic Energy Commission that was to be established by the first GA resolution. Some may not be familiar with what happened after that. So if I could just go back very briefly again to the history. The story is not a long one. The commission was duly established and held its first meeting in June 1946 in New York City. It was at that meeting that the US representative, Bernard Baruch, presented a plan that proposed international ownership and management of all dangerous nuclear activities, the elimination of nuclear weapons once these controls were verified and operational, and then the creation of an international authority in this regard, one not subject to Security Council veto, which is a really interesting point to also mention. This Baruch plan served as the primary starting point for the Commission's discussions. It also became the largest bone of contention, as you can imagine, one that ultimately paralyzed, unfortunately, its work. Then the plan was rejected by the Soviet Union and no other alternative emerged. And indeed, by the time of its report to the Security Council at the end of 1946, the Commission indicated that it intended to proceed on the assumption that inquiry into matter of atomic energy and recommendation for its control were most urgent problems before it, and that if a satisfactory solution to that problem could be found, it might furnish a guide for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And superficially, this sounds like the same tune that we have been hearing for 80 years, the past 80 years. That disarmament is always something that will happen later when the time is right, and as a reward for peace rather than prerequisite for peace. But the Commission also made clear something else that will be familiar to all of us. The first one is it determined that the prohibition alone was not enough. The disarmament had to occur within a broader, technically grounded system of controls. But more than that, it determined that effective control was scientifically and technologically feasible, with no technical reason to doubt that robust inspection and safeguard system could prevent diversion, clandestine production, or misuse of nuclear materials. The UN Atomic Energy Agency ceased its activities in 1949 and was ultimately dissolved in 1952. A year later, through a separate initiative by President Eisenhower, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, was born. But I would like to argue that failure of the original commission should motivate us as much as the goals of the resolution that established it. Both made it clear that from the very start of the atomic age, political will, not technical feasibility, is the real barrier to disarmament. 80 years after the first GA resolution was adopted, we just need to recall that the world has tools, expertise, and institutions also those who drafted the resolution lacked. So let us see this anniversary not simply as an occasion for commemoration, but also, if you will, call for action. We need to act. There has been a great deal of discussion about the future and the purpose of the UN, and we are now in the middle of it at the United Nations. Some say that it has strayed from its founding purpose, from its core mandates, and to a certain extent, I actually agree. We need to really change and transform ourselves. But that would also include our call, let's return to first principles, but let's also recall in full what those were. And if we are to return to our core mandates, that means, and if I could suggest, we need to start with the very first one, which is nuclear disarmament. So let us go back to the foundational purpose of the United Nations. And I think we will use this occasion to recall and start our action towards that again. Thank you very much. Back to you, Zia.
Thank you so much, Izumi, for those remarks and for creating the context both of the work of the Commission and also the need to actually use this as an opportunity to take action and to think forwards into the future, beginning with first principles. And so we have some questions from our webinar participants, but let me first note that as the Undersecretary General mentioned, the Commission was set up and the United States did propose a plan for a path to the elimination of nuclear weapons. So certainly at that stage and later on through signing and ratifying the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the US has committed itself under international law to the obligation of nuclear disarmament, and that is to be achieved, not just a goal, but an actual concrete achievement that is a commitment. But I also wanted to note that in response to the US proposal of the Baruch Plan, the Soviet Union also produced a pioneering and path-breaking proposal that is worth recalling at this instance, and that was the Gromyko Plan, which was the very first proposed text for a convention It was called the Draft International Convention to Prohibit the Production and Employment of Weapons Based on the Use of Atomic Energy for the Purpose of Mass Destruction. It was the very first nuclear ban treaty, and it said that you cannot use nuclear weapons in any circumstances whatsoever. The production and storage of nuclear weapons is prohibited, and all existing nuclear weapons must be destroyed within a period of 3 months, and that any violation will be seen as a threat and a crime against humanity. And unfortunately, the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union prevented constructive engagement with either of the two plans. But we have, at least from the very beginning, even though they were in contention and competition and conflict, superpowers were able to make constructive proposals for how to meet the shared goal of nuclear disarmament. So let me ask as a first question that as the international community struggles with what is often called a new period of great power competition and contestation, from the point of view of the United Nations, do you have a perspective on the question of how to have the superpowers of today, the great powers of today, begin to understand that they can actually have competing visions, but commit to the same goal as the United States and the Soviet Union did back then?
Thank you for that really great questions. Yeah, you always ask the right questions. Let me respond this way. And thank you for also referring to the Gromyko plan as well. And then, I mean, we know what happened, all of us. It's the geopolitics. And you know, I never use the terminology of great power because what they do sometimes is not so great. So let me refer to them as a big military power or superpowers. You know, it's also interesting to observe that what happened afterwards, geopolitics killed both plans. And I just mentioned in my remark Eisenhower, but also the making of the NPT, there was the famous Irish resolution as well. So the efforts related to these big strategic issues, most prominent, you know, nuclear disarmament, has always been a sort of combination of those big military power competition, and you know, some of the ideas and initiatives that they might propose, and then they might not be able to achieve, you know, agreements through negotiations just between them, the nuclear powers. But also it is fed by really interesting, important visions by middle powers or the smaller countries that have the idea for policy initiatives and the ability to form coalitions or the groups, alliances to push the overall agenda. So this is, you know, this is partly the reason why I am so, I've been working for the UN for so many years. It's an interesting platform. It's called multilateralism. And so we need to make sure that these combination of powers and ideas and visions will actually, you know, will be inserted in today's world. Now, I mentioned that we have a concrete opportunity called the Review Conference of the NPT. You know, TPNW was also very much a making. I mean, you know, we do have many examples of how non-nuclear weapon states, smaller states, middle powers have come together with the vision and then formed the important coalition. So we need to make sure that these dynamics will be now reinforced and strengthened. And I think we are beginning to see that sort of alliances against the background of going beyond nuclear issues, against the background of many states really feeling the risk of the rules-based international order, or the international order on the basis of international law under severe attack. So we need to make sure that this coalition of various countries will come together and rally behind this very important. This is for our survival. It's not just a utopian, idealistic charity cause, but this is everyone's survival and safety and security. So that's the response to your great question.
Thank you so much. And one more question, if I might, that we talked about the Resolution 1, the first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations after it was created, with a charter having been agreed in San Francisco earlier. There are many people who see now that the United Nations is under perhaps the most severe threat as the architecture of the global community since that period, especially because of the policies now being pursued by the Trump administration and the larger global contest that is taking place. Since we're talking about multilateralism and the United Nations as an institutional structure within which states can actually have these conversations, would you like to reflect on the crucial role that the United Nations can play in continuing to be the international architecture for multilateral diplomacy, where all states actually begin from the presumption of sovereign equality and therefore have a right for everybody's security to be part of the conversation, and not just, as you said, military powers deciding what is in their security interests and the rest of us must endure the consequence of their decisions?
Yes, another great question. And I think it's, these kinds of reflections are really coming to the fore. I mean, it's being discussed now everywhere. Let me answer this way. Number one, we need to also change the UN. I mean, I've been with the UN for so many years. I've dealt with many different issues. I will be the first one to say that we have to really change ourselves. I'm not going to get into details, but we are acutely aware, and this is not about cost cutting. It's not about reduction of budget, financial resources. It has to be that the UN as a structure has to become more effective as such. So we're making that efforts ourselves. It's been a very painful process. It's continuing, but we need to do that. But then the second, I think, is the broader strategic political discussions of key member states, key members of the United Nations that are not currently the military superpower, but those who still have enormous amount of power and influencing by coming together around a vision and the way forward. And I think it is starting to happen. For one thing, I mean, if you follow UN Secretary General's speeches, he has been talking about real sort of attacks against international law, and the very foundation of the international order is being really attacked by big countries. And if this trend is allowed to continue, we will basically lose the order. So we've been talking about this very frankly. And I think that realization, understanding has been shared by so many other countries. I mean, I don't want to just use this example because it's been mentioned by so many. It's been in the big news. But Canadian Prime Minister's speech at Davos, he is basically talking about the middle powers actually do have power and influencing. They're not powerless, but indeed they do. And it's a call to action. Again, the way I listen to his speech is that it's a call to action. And I use his expression. We need to make sure that a new international order will be something better, stronger, more resilient, and also fair. So I think, the voices are emerging to, of course, protect what we have, And then, in our community, it's the NPT at the moment, but also make sure that we will move forward to strengthen it and eventually build something that is stronger and a better international order, and that is fair. So the countries in the global south are absolutely key in this. So again, going back to how important it is for us to join forces around a vision of cooperation rather than division and a competition. If the current trend is allowed to continue, I don't think it will, benefit anyone's security, anyone's well-being, any country, including the big countries as well. So, it's a difficult time. I feel the challenge every day in my daily work, but that's why we need to work even harder and come together, join forces.
Thank you very much. And one last question, since I know you do have to leave. And that question is that you've mentioned the role of middle powers, states from the global south, and others as distinct from the military powers that dominate some areas of global decision-making on key security issues. But many of the participants in our webinar are scientists, scholars, academics, part of various civil society organizations, including our Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. The rise of civil society is a relatively new player in the history of the process that we're talking about, since there was nowhere near the kind of global civil society when Resolution 1 was being passed in what we have today. So do you have any advice for what civil society, especially in the United States and other countries from which many of our members are drawn, can make its voice heard in a way that supports the kinds of discussion that we're having today about the centrality of the role of the United Nations, of multilateral diplomacy, and of moving forward on this old shared core goal of saving the world so we can actually make a better world?
Yeah, civil society, professional groups like scientist groups, the doctors, the lawyers, they are absolutely critical in a crisis period like the one that we're in at the moment, and they have been in the past. It's interesting to see that there is the sort of alternative truth narratives that are now, because of social media, etc. It's spreading, but this is exactly the moment that these experts, people with a real scientific and other professional backgrounds, really have to increase their voices. How can they make influences? Again, continue speaking, continue to stick to the real hardcore issues, the evidence and all of that, but perhaps to also find additional measures to reach out to younger people who will be able to also influence their peers. So, this realization how important civil society is. I mean, after all, partly the reason the Cold War ended, I think, was also because of the civil society power and the voices at the time. So we need to build that pressure factor, if you will. Again, we need to better utilize networkings. And I think the younger people here will be absolutely critical voices. So let us, we at the UN, it's not because we need to tick a sort of a checkpoint, the box to have consulted. We need to really work with you to make sure that those, I still believe in the common sense of ordinary people, and that common sense of ordinary people really has to have a bigger influencing power, and that is why we want to work with you much more closely. I want to put a real sort of a voice of confidence in what you can do, and let us continue to work very closely for our joint objectives.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary General Izumi Nakamitsu. And on behalf of all the webinar participants, we're very grateful for you to take the time out of a very busy schedule and to be with us today to mark this anniversary and to begin the conversation how we can take this common cause further forward. So again, thank you very much for being with us today. And if I can, before I hand the webinar over to Dr. Patricia Lewis to make her remarks, I just wanted to note that in the spirit of what the Undersecretary General mentioned about the common sense of ordinary people, it's worth remembering that in 1946, also at the same time as the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 1, within a few months, Albert Einstein launched the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists based in Princeton, calling for a public education campaign about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And in the letters that Einstein wrote to physicists all over the world in 1946, calling for support for this goal, Einstein said that we believe that only an educated and aroused and insistent citizenry can address the real challenge of nuclear weapons. And he said, we believe that citizens will act for life and not for death once they fully understand the dangers of nuclear weapons. And so this faith in the common sense of ordinary people, once we help everybody understand the ability that they have to participate in the process of decision making and to understand the issues, is key. So with that, let me hand the floor over to Dr. Patricia Lewis to make her opening remarks. So Patricia, please.
Thank you, Zia. I hope everyone can hear me, and that there isn't too much background noise. So I want to build on what Izumi has said. And I want to start by talking about the two strands that we've seen that sometimes have competed against each other and sometimes have worked together throughout disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation measures, be those on a bilateral level or on a multilateral level. And that's the disarmament and arms control and non-proliferation approach. And then there's a humanitarian approach to disarmament. And those two strands of thought have been really significant in getting us to where we are today. So the first one, which I'm going to address, is the issue of the effects of weapons, which is the humanitarian impact of weapons. And this is based very much in modern day on an 1899 convention, the Hague Convention, in which was a clause called the Martens Clause, in which it talked about weapons that were against the dictates of the public conscience, was how it was put there. In other words, their effects were so horrendous, so repulsive, that the whole of the public rose up against them in order to eliminate them, ban their use, and so on. This led to the Geneva Protocol in 1925 to ban the use of chemical and biological weapons. And this is one strand of the way in which governments, the public, international organizations have thought about disarmament and arms control. And it led to this strand has led to a number of treaties, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which led to a ban on blinding laser weapons, for example, a curtail in the use of landmines and so on, and is currently looking at how to address the issue of autonomous weapons, weapons that make the decision to kill without the last human intervention. It led to, as well, the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. It led to the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, the Chemical Weapons of 1993, the Mine Ban Convention in 1997, Small Arms and Light Weapons Program of Action in 2001, and the Cluster on the Convention on Cluster Munitions, in 2008. And I would say as well that the thread that goes through this has been very much what then competed with the other side of the coin, which is the issue of security or the military use of weapons, the requirement for weapons to defend, the requirement for weapons to deter, the requirement for weapons, to, if you like, to prevent conflict. And this is a completely different strand of thought that has intertwined throughout the years, in which this has led to, of course, the arms control arrangement, particularly the nuclear arms control, the bilateral treaties of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, and so on. And these international agreements were deliberately set out to curb and shape the arms competition between states. They were designed specifically with the idea of reducing military threat through transparency as much as possible, through predictability, but also including the concept of deterrence, so how to deter the use of weapons in war, and particularly those, of course, which lead to the worst possible effects. So these two strands have played out over the years and have led to a lot of progress in terms of the way that we think about these weapons. So, for example, during the Mine Ban Convention negotiations, the main issue was the long-lasting weapons of mass destruction in slow motion, as it was called, the long-lasting effects of mines on ordinary populations, which those effects lasted decades after the conflict. And people were losing their limbs, people were losing their livelihoods as a consequence, or their lives as a result of these mines being left in the ground. And so there was a very large demining effort put in place. And even countries that haven't joined the treaty have joined in the demining efforts. However, in order to get that convention, the militaries of the governments that were negotiating had to be convinced that they were no longer militarily useful. And that argument was made very strongly as the argument against cluster munitions. But as you well know, that argument is currently has had a resurgence in that has had a challenge. And there are states now that, despite the humanitarian impact of mines, are now starting to pull away because of the fear of conflict. So the illustration is to show that these things are in constant competition. And I think that we have to understand that in order to have got to where we've got to today, we have to address all of these concerns in a way that we understand the various competing elements of the international system and where they might lead. So the UN General Assembly Resolution number 1, which is the one we're here to commemorate today, also led to a focus very much on weapons of mass destruction in the UN. And Izumi talked also about the Atomic Energy Commission. But one of the big focuses that came from 1945 onwards was the issue of nuclear weapons testing and the environmental, health, societal impacts, particularly on indigenous peoples, that nuclear weapons had. So we look at the US tribal lands, look at the Aboriginal lands in Australia, the Pacific Islands, the Kazakhs in Semipalatinsk, the Novaya Zemlya, nomadic peoples, and so on. And the people of Lopnor in China as well. These are people who often have very little political power domestically, and therefore governments will take their lands and test on them. It was the 1963 post-Cuban Missile Crisis treaty that led to the banning of atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. Now, France and China did continue to test in the atmosphere after that, but after a few years, they stopped as well. So now all nuclear weapons tests, if they do take place, and only North Korea has tested since the test ban was introduced in the mid-90s, all nuclear weapons tests have taken place underground, therefore creating less of a humanitarian impact than a lot less of a humanitarian impact than atmospheric tests. So you can see how the interplay of humanitarian impact and arms control have worked together there. So Izumi mentioned the Irish resolution, which started in 1959 and began as an attempt to try to get a curb on the nuclear arms race. Then, of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And presciently, the Irish Foreign Minister, Frank Aiken, he had pushed through this whole approach to non-proliferation and disarmament. So in 1961, this resolution was adopted within the General Assembly. And this then led post-Cuba to not only the Partial Test Ban Treaty, but then the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So although the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was originally supposed to be focused on the issue of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to countries other than those who already possess them, in fact, it led to if you like, a trilateral approach to nuclear disarmament, which was the preventing of the spread, the monitoring of the technologies so that they couldn't be easily transferred from peaceful to military use. And with that went promotion on peaceful use, and also what Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is on nuclear disarmament. And this was extremely controversial at the time. The possessors of nuclear weapons were quite keen to not only keep nuclear weapons themselves, but also assist their allies who they deemed worthy of getting nuclear weapons. And a number of countries continued with that approach all the way through up until the 1980s and even the 90s. But those that joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty eventually all agreed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And they were also committed, as Izumi said, to nuclear disarmament. But unfortunately, I think as we've seen since the end of the Cold War, we saw a flurry of activity which was very positive and very optimistic about the future, in which there were a number of treaties with really good verification regimes negotiated, a number of conventional weapons treaties, and we mentioned chemical weapons as well. But after the indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995 and the adoption of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which has yet to enter into force, there has been not only a slowdown, but a real walking back, which you can start to look at in terms of the 2002 withdrawal from the ABM Treaty by the United States, and then later on the subsequent withdrawal from the INF Treaty. And now we're about to enter into a phase where the New START Treaty, the last of the bilateral treaties in existence, will end in a few days' time. And there is nothing left at the moment to replace it. That's not to say that negotiations can start up again. It's not to say that they couldn't agree to extend on an informal basis not the monitoring, they've stopped doing that, but at least the constraints. They could do that. They could do that at any time. But I think it's unfortunately it's illustrative of the really bad situation that we've got into now. And as a result of that, as we started to see a move away from nuclear disarmament progress, and we started to see the first beginnings of a rise in conflicts from the decrease at the end of the Cold War. And then, of course, reaching a point now where we have a major conflict ongoing in Europe, with a nuclear weapon state attacking a non-nuclear weapon state and threatening to use nuclear weapons in that conflict, which is a terribly shocking thing. That state is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. This has, I think, sharpened minds. This was understood in advance by a number of countries, particularly the strong key supporters of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's Ireland, Mexico, Austria, New Zealand, to name a few, who really took the lead to push for a ban. I should mention South Africa as well, who were very, very strong on this, of course, and really important. And they really started to push to strengthen Article 6 and create a treaty that would ban nuclear weapons in the same way that chemical weapons are banned, in the same way that biological weapons are banned, landmines are banned, and so on. And in fact, nuclear weapons tests have been banned. So it was a long tradition to unite the humanitarian approach with the arms control and disarmament non-proliferation approach. And they were successful in negotiating a treaty in 2017. They based their thinking and their knowledge and expertise on a series of conferences called the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Conferences that took place between 2013 and 2022. And then an open consultation called an open-ended working group between 2013 and 2016, and very much focused on the inhumane effects of nuclear weapons. Because after all, if we are banning chemical weapons because of their inhumane effects, if we're banning biological weapons because of their inhumane effects, and landmines and cluster munitions, then nuclear weapons surely are a candidate for the same approach. As a result of that, as Zia mentioned, the scientific advisory group was set up in 2023 for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that Zia and I co-chair, and I see a number of our colleagues are on the call, so thank you so much for coming. That's great. And we proposed as well that the UN might want to set up a UN panel looking at the UN scientific panel looking at the effects of nuclear weapons in the long term, the environmental effects, because the last study that took place was in the late 1980s. And we've actually learned a great deal more. All of the information that's come out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki over 80 years has been analyzed. And often, as many people on this call will know, it takes that long to get the information that you need about the effects of nuclear weapons on human bodies, on the environment. Also, we have new information coming out about gendered effects, for example, new information coming out about thresholds of nuclear radiation and so on and so forth. We also have new information, of course, on the long-term environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. We need to understand how this is not an issue that just affects those that have nuclear weapons or those that might be in a regional war and surrounded. It's not just a regional effect, it's global. And it's not just global, it's long-term. A nuclear war that include the use of a small fraction of the world's nuclear arsenals would result in maybe decades-long global famine, for example. That's one of the major findings that's come out of this research. So this long-term humanitarian impact, coupled with the need to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, to increase transparency and predictability, in other words, the arms control piece, these two things need to come together again. And when they do, they're stronger. And when they do, they have more longevity and they will be what I call better weatherproofed. So we need to think about when we're designing treaties, and I will close on this, how to put in place measures within our treaties that will mean that when the political winds change, when things are not so favorable, when countries aren't getting on so well, that the treaties will have longevity, that they will still be relevant and they will still be able to be implemented through these very difficult times. I'll stop there, Zia, and open up for questions.
Thank you, Patricia. And if I can ask Chris King, would he be ready to join the Q&A at this stage as well, to stand in for, thank you. And just to reintroduce Chris King, Chris is the Chief of the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch within the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs that falls under the leadership of Under Secretary General Nakamitsu, and has a distinguished career, including as Secretary General of various of the major international multilateral nuclear diplomacy processes, including the TPNW and the NPT Review Conferences. So thank you very much for Chris for standing in at this at such short notice. So we have time until 12:30 for about half an hour for about questions. And so if I can, let me begin by asking one of the questions from the audience about, could you comment on the importance of the renewal of the New START treaty between the US and Russia, which is set to expire next week, as Undersecretary General Nakamitsu mentioned, given that the commitment to bilateral arms control and the assumption that it would be an enduring and stable foundation for larger and further step-by-step measures was a core working assumption of many of the agreements in the international community, including as part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty agreements that were made at the review conferences in the past. So Patricia, do you want to take that? And then I'll see if Chris would like to jump in on that.
Sure. I mean, obviously, we're in a very difficult situation. I mentioned that we were a few days away having no bilateral agreement between the two countries. And I think that, it is possible that it could just be decided that they will continue to observe the constraints. They have stopped the monitoring some time ago, as people will know. And so, I think that this is a really difficult issue because the relationships now are very hard to fathom. They're in a state of flux, that's for sure. And the US has been also trying to engage China on the issue of nuclear arms control. And they've had some success in engaging China on a statement which was made at the end of 2024 between the presidents of the US and China on not allowing artificial intelligence into command and control systems for nuclear weapons, which is a good statement to make. Russia hasn't joined in on that. I don't know if there have been overtures to try to get Russia to join in on that. And I think China would be very interested in looking at how to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. And I think all of us on this call are probably very interested in how to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So maybe there's a new track to go down. My sense from President Trump is he wants to break with the past. But, he has made various statements on, not wanting to use nuclear weapons. He's at the moment, very heavily trying to put pressure on Iran and the issue of nuclear weapons as well. And in his first term, tried a different approach with North Korea. So, we need to, I think, perhaps ourselves be creative about how we might make proposals as to what might go forward. By all means, extend the constraints of the treaty, absolutely. But maybe we need to move away from the old style bilateral arms control treaties into a very different mode for now. While we're in this state of flux, while we're in a state where there is clearly a lot of upheaval and a lot of uncertainty, and try to think perhaps well, for me, I would focus on trying to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. We have the treaty on the prohibition, the ban, that's in place. We have the treaty on the non-proliferation, that's in place. We have the treaty on preventing nuclear tests. It's not in force. We should be putting focus on that for sure. But let's also put in that next piece of the puzzle, which is on the prevention of use.
Thank you, Patricia. Chris, would you like to comment on this?
Sure. And thanks very much, Zia, and to the organizers as well. And I'm sorry that I am in fact a poor substitute for the High Representative, but I will do my best. I agree with very much what Patricia said. I don't know that the United States is planning on responding to the Russian overtures to maintain the central limits of New START. I suspect some of that has to do with the fact that Russia is also testing strategic delivery vehicles that are not or would not come under the auspices of New START. I think that's another thing that needs to be factored in. I do think that if the central limits were to be maintained and they were done so in good faith, it is a very, very good idea given the sheer disparity between the Russian and US arsenals and the rest of the other nuclear armed states. And I also think there is clearly room for a follow-on agreement to New START to further reduce those arsenals. But I also agree with what Patricia said, that this is a very new environment. And I think maybe this, in an ideal world, this would serve as an opportunity for a reset on an arms control or a process that looks a little bit different, that starts to take into account some of the things that were missed the first time around, including, non-strategic nuclear weapons, which obviously are an incredible threat when we're talking about the use of nuclear weapons. Those are the ones that would likely be used first. But also incorporating the other nuclear weapon states and the other states that possess nuclear weapons into that process as well. And when it comes to weatherproofing, which I think is a great expression, by the way, Patricia, and I will use it, I suspect that one of the things, particularly, you mentioned the INF Treaty, and the problem with the INF Treaty, of course, is that it had a very limited verification protocol. And one of the things you need is verification in good times and bad, because it's great to have a treaty that everyone agrees on in the good times, but you want to make sure that you have that hard verification in there, trust but verify going forward. So I think that that's one of the key lessons that we need to learn. I also really believe that the disarmament non-proliferation regime was able to achieve what it was able to achieve because it's a great combination of multilateral measures as the base, but supplemented by regional measures, bilateral measures, and even unilateral measures. And I really think that's something we need to focus on, as well as how do those interlocking pieces come together to create a greater whole of what we need. But going forward, I think the Secretary General has been pretty clear that the end of constraints on strategic arms control is a very dangerous thing. It's been good for collective security, not least the security of the states involved. And, that the two sides should agree on a successor framework as soon as possible.
Thank you, Chris. And a related question on this. As I mentioned, one of the core assumptions of a large part of the process of addressing the dangers of nuclear weapons over the last 80 years has been the presumption of a step-by-step process of constraining, limiting, capping certain kinds of nuclear weapon activities, certain kinds of nuclear weapon systems, the numbers and the capabilities and so on. And in the year 2000, the NPT Review Conference adopted unanimously 13 steps to take the nuclear disarmament agenda forward. And a key commitment that was made by the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized under the NPT, including the United States, Russia, and China, was the principle of irreversibility as part of all nuclear disarmament measures. And I'd just like you and Patricia, if you could, to reflect for a minute for us on whether you see the current and recent actions by some of these nuclear weapon states as undermining this kind of core assumption and commitment of irreversibility, where we see some states building up their nuclear arsenals, some countries withdrawing from treaties, some countries threatening to resume activities like nuclear weapon testing that had agreed that they would not be undertaken. And so if the core presumption of irreversibility is now to be set aside because of what these states are doing, what does that mean for being able to make meaningful commitments multilaterally and bilaterally going forward? I mean, can you help us understand how central the question of irreversibility in the commitments that states have made in the past and going forward needs to be to establish a solid foundation for states to make enduring national security commitments? So, Chris, do you want to take that first, and then I'll ask Patricia for her observations on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, see, obviously it's essential in irreversibility, transparency. These are core principles when it comes to nuclear disarmament and disarmament in general. I mean, I think when we talk about irreversibility, there is both a technical component to it and a political component to it. And I think, unfortunately, that technical component to it, even if you dismantle a test site, even if you dismantle a fissile material production facility, at some point in time, given time and effort, you will be able to reconstitute them. So it's really about making them so difficult to achieve that by the time the political momentum can actually switch. I do agree with you that what we are seeing, and I think this is Izumi referred to the Cold War. I think this is something that is really terrifying to me, is that, the memory, our collective memory seems to be really, really short when it comes to why they undertook those commitments in 2000 in the first place. And it was an understanding of the lessons learned from the Cold War. That testing is bad for everyone. Arms races are bad for everyone. And that, I think, is what we need to really reinforce, is the notion that, those lessons were learned for a reason. And even in a very different, very much more complex geopolitical environment, we still have to apply them. And Zia, you mentioned earlier the scientific panel on nuclear war effects. That's why I think that is such a really essential activity that is going on right now, to be able to remind not just the policy community or the scientific community, but using hard scientific facts, the world at large, that the consequences of a nuclear war would affect everyone and would be inherently damaging for the entire world. And that, I think, will help us get back on the road to why we made commitments about irreversibility in the first place. And then hopefully, again, as I said, shift that political pendulum.
Thank you, Chris. Patricia, would you like to share your ideas and thinking about this question of the centrality of irreversibility?
Sure. I mean, I've never been as convinced about the use of the word irreversibility, because there have been many debates in the arms control community of the need essentially to have at least for a while, a small amount of reversibility in any disarmament process should things not work so well. And that's been built into discussions from the beginning. So I've always felt, and I can be perhaps a little bit more honest now. I no longer work for the UN or Chatham House than others might be. So I don't have to be quite so circumspect in what I say. I don't think that the nuclear weapon states are currently, for the most part, negotiating in good faith in the ways in which they're approaching their Article 6 commitments. It's quite clear, I think, to anyone that they've moved away from their commitments on Article 6. And they will say, of course, that it's a different security environment now. But honestly and truly, is it really worse than the Cold War, in which everyone was on hair trigger alert and there was this huge ideological battle in which we had so many near misses, near uses of nuclear weapons, not only accident, but actually, near deliberate uses of nuclear weapons? Are we really in as bad a situation as that? Because that was a terrible situation, right? And as I think, as Chris says, we have to remember the Cold War properly. We can't keep forgetting history or reinventing history. I mean, I hear people say, oh, if only could go back to the stability of the Cold War. It was not stable at all. It was very unstable. It was very frightening. And we shouldn't look back with rose-tinted spectacles and imagine that things, that because things in the end didn't lead to nuclear war, that they couldn't have. And indeed, they easily could have. And, we often joke that there's more evidence in the case of preventing nuclear weapons use for the hand of God than there is for nuclear deterrence. So we've got a situation, I think, in which we're not speaking the truth at the moment. And everyone's being a little bit too polite about what's going on. And I'm seeing a number of countries being less and less polite, and perhaps they just need some hard truths come back at them as to what might happen. There is a Nobel Prize in this. I don't care who gets it, but there is a Nobel Prize in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And frankly, they're not very useful. You can't use them militarily. You can't take territory. You use them, your territory that you've used them on is gone. Probably your command and control systems have been blown out of the sky as well, out of the water. You'll be acting in a way that you'll be at a huge loss. And as you say, the whole world comes with you when you do things like that. So they're not usable. So if they're not usable, we should be addressing how to prevent their use. Part of that, a large part of that, is nuclear disarmament. Another part of it is behavior and how people behave. And we ought to be looking at that a lot more, I think.
Thank you. Among the questions that we have from our audience, there's one that talks about not just the issue of nuclear weapons, but the question of this concern about putting weapons in space as a new domain of conflict. And in some cases, the suggestion has been made that at least one nuclear armed state, Russia may already have been thinking about putting a nuclear weapon in space, even though there is a treaty that prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in space. So could Patricia and Chris, could you help us think about this question about the need for attention to go to forestalling perhaps a new space, a new arena for conflict that might end up including nuclear weapons, and especially given the fact that the proposal for a ban on putting weapons in space has actually come from China and Russia and not from Washington and some of the Western European allies. And so Patricia first and then Chris.
So I think you're right, Zia. We're probably too late in that their weapons of a type already exist in space. I mean, space is one big digital platform. It's one big cyber platform, and cyber weapons are already in space. There are, constant buzzing activities, satellites going around other satellites, a bit like we're seeing ships come up to the cables of the southwest of Ireland, for example. And, what are they doing? Picking up information? Are they looking about how to destroy them? This is going on in a similar way in space. We are all so dependent on space. Every single computer, every single phone requires the timing signals from space to keep them in sync. We all are highly dependent on the positioning systems and navigational systems that exist. We are all dependent on space for our communications. We're highly dependent on them for our communications for emergency services, for example. It's very, very similar to the issue of nuclear weapons in that if there is destruction of our amazing assets in space, either by the blowing up of a few satellites and causing enough debris to destroy so many others, or by deliberate destruction of certain types of satellites by one adversary against another, we're all going to suffer. The whole world will suffer. And as we know, the people who suffer always the most are the poorest, who have fewer alternatives. So, for those countries that are able to, we've already got atomic clocks being put in place to make up for the timing signals. That's very good resilience planning. But, not every country might be able to afford that. And will we be able to extend that to everybody, I think, is the other question. But, the idea of blowing things up in space should be an anathema to us all. So, yes, I would definitely focus on that. We've had a number of initiatives over the years, particularly from the European Union. We've also had a very interesting initiative from the UK, which has involved a large number of countries through the UN General Assembly on responsible behavior in space, which is based on responsible behavior on cyberspace. And that's really about the way you behave in space, which is perhaps a better route in than just about the placement of weapons.
Thank you. Chris, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I should start this by saying that I do not deal with the issue of outer space as a domain of conflict. That is my colleagues in our office in Geneva handle that process. But just to say that I would agree with what Patricia said, which is obviously we are incredibly dependent on space. I do think that space is already militarized, but just from my perspective, which obviously is coming from a much more WMD perspective, which is to say we have the Outer Space Treaty, and that's very clear about the not placing nuclear weapons in outer space. And I think that that's something that very much needs to be protected. It's been an under-heralded treaty for a very long time, particularly with regards to that. It's obviously came out of the post-Cuban Missile Crisis environment, and I think it's something that really needs to be focused on. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here is that often we tend to think about these issues in silos, outer space, nuclear, conventional. I think it's time we really started thinking about what the combined ramifications of all of these threats actually are.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, let me ask a question that, since Chris mentioned, the Geneva and the UN processes for multilateral diplomacy in Geneva are separate from those in New York, to talk about whether, in your view, where we are now, given not just that some of the existing treaties have been allowed to lapse, others there are issues of violations, and some have yet to enter into force. And one treaty in particular, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which the UN General Assembly issued a negotiating mandate for in 1993, has still not begun formal negotiations at the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which is the body charged with negotiating such treaties. Chris, could you help us understand the challenges that the UN disarmament negotiating machinery faces, given the experience over the last couple of decades, and what that means for us being able to think about that process going forward as the carrier for these kinds of multilateral processes?
Thanks. Yeah. And look, I think the first thing to recognize is that the UN is really, really big. There are a lot of member states in the UN, and therefore there are a lot of views that necessarily have to be taken into account. We do work on the principle that every member state has the same rights as all of the other member states, obviously with the exception of the Security Council. But I think if you look at the history of the treaties that have been negotiated, they've been negotiated in much smaller groups. I think there's still a rationale for the machinery as we have it. Which is to say the Conference on Disarmament, being a smaller body, and then you have the universal aspects which take place obviously in the first committee of the General Assembly, and then of course you have the UN Disarmament Commission as well. I think if states want to overhaul that, they really need to think about whether they need a new special session on disarmament. That's entirely up to them. But I will say, I think the machinery is not doing what it's meant to do right now. Is that a question of the geopolitical environment, or is that a problem with the machinery, or is it both? And I think those are two very valid questions that need to be asked. One thing I would say is that I have been really interested in the way that the General Assembly has now begun to function more as a de facto mandate, not just a mandate providing body, but a negotiating body for things like, cyber issues, space issues. I think that's really, really interesting. I think it's interesting that we've seen AI come through the humanitarian domain through the CCW and as Patricia was talking about, the autonomous weapon systems. And of course, I think, the General Assembly was the one that broke the deadlock with the TPNW, the first multilateral nuclear disarmament treaty in decades. So I think that there is it's unwieldy. It's really difficult to get an outcome. Often that outcome is lowest common denominator, but it is multilateral. So therefore, I think they're the best outcomes because they are binding on the entire international community. And if you can get everyone agree to it, everyone has a stake in it. I think there's a really important point to be made there. I think one of the issues that states need to look at is what does a veto mean in the current environment? Because I don't think vetoes are used necessarily in the way that they're intended to. I should say, what does consensus mean in the current environment? Because I don't think consensus is used in the way that it was meant to. It's used as a veto. It's not used as trying to find something that everyone is engaged with. It's used to really veto processes out of hand. And I think the Fissile Material Treaty is case in point there. So these, I think, are some of the issues that need to be examined. But I think that this is something that states really need to think long and hard about moving forward about, fit for purpose and what does that mean in the current environment.
Thank you, Chris. Patricia, do you want to reflect on the status of the UN disarmament negotiating machinery?
Yes, I mean, I had to give a talk on it every year when I was in the UN, so I made many proposals. I don't think it really matters that much. I think if states wanted to make something work, they can make something work. I remember during the late 1980s, there was a moribund negotiation on mutual balanced force reductions in Vienna, in which they would turn up, read prepared statements, go away again, and went on for years. And then somebody got the great idea of holding what they called the mandate talks at breakfast time and developing a whole new mandate. And once they developed the mandate, they got rid of the mutual balanced force reduction talks and brought in the Conventional Force Reduction Treaty negotiations. And if you want to, you can. And we've seen that with, the Mine Convention. We just started a group of like-minded states in Ottawa. We've seen it on a number of other similar things. And you can look at the whole of the convention on certain conventional weapons. The CCW is exactly that. You have a framework treaty, and then some states are parties to protocols and not others. And, you've got a big mix in that. And not everyone has to agree on everything all the time. They can do all of that. I just wanted to just make a pitch for Vienna. I mentioned Vienna in the conventional weapons sense, but they've also done quite a lot on space. Let's not forget that the work that's been done within the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, particularly on long-term sustainability and on the issues of debris and so on, have been absolutely vital to international security. And of course, the autonomous weapons big conference that was held recently there, and what might come of that. So, apart from New York, we've got the Security Council, and gets very excited about the Security Council. Actually, a huge amount of work goes on in Geneva. And we mentioned the Conference on Disarmament, but don't forget all the other processes in Geneva, such as biological weapons, of course. We shouldn't forget those, or indeed all the conventional weapons stuff that goes on there too, including the mine ban and Vienna. So those are alternatives, and particularly where things are very difficult in terms of getting visas to come into the United States. Vienna and Geneva start to look at very attractive concerns for many countries that are thinking of starting up new initiatives. Oh, can I say something about the step-by-step approach, Thea?
Please.
Yeah, so, I think this step-by-step has been a real millstone around everyone's necks. It's a real pity, because the idea that something would be as sequential in a human endeavor, which is so complex and in a very difficult environment. So you've got your environment, you've got your processes, and the environments affect the process affects the environments. It's a classic wicked problem. And the idea that you might say, right, we'll do step 1, step 2, step 3, then there'll be step 4, then there'll be step 5, is clearly nonsensical. I'm trying to be polite. It doesn't work like that. Maybe if we're doing ballroom dancing, we could do lots of different ballroom dances and see which one worked. And maybe that would be a better step-by-step approach. But it's in fact a really, we just should go to the next one where we can get some traction, and not keep harping back to somebody deciding that the next step would be the fissile material issue, because it hasn't been, and it's got in the way, and it's made, I think it's become its own problem in a way, by saying it comes next. Does it really need to come next? I don't think so. It could come last.
So thank you.
Sorry, could I just add something to that, Zia,
Please, Chris.
if I may? I mean, I think Patricia makes a very pertinent point, and my attitude to this has always been, if it gets done, it shouldn't matter how it gets done. And I do think that's what I was trying to say about mutually reinforcing. Like, the fact that you have the NPT and the TPNW doesn't mean they're in competition. They're trying to achieve the same goal, but just by different mechanisms. And the CTBT is complementary to that. Arms control is complementary to that. So how this gets done shouldn't be the problem. It should be it's the fact that it's getting done. And I think, when it comes to the step-by-step, we've always said that, it's fine to take a step-by-step approach, but you have to take the steps. And I suspect that one of the reasons why the GA has been so successful on things like cyber and space and getting movement on those issues is because they are areas that are ripe for at least having dialogue on. They're not as sticky. And one of the things that I would question, and this is perhaps something that member states, and again, my own personal view, but one of the things that member states I think really need to think about is the agenda that they keep trying to ram through the Conference on Disarmament the appropriate agenda for today? Because it's the same agenda that's been on the cards for 30 years. So that's just one thing I would add to what Patricia said.
So thank you both. We're now reaching the end of our webinar. So with that, I'd like to ask all of our participants to join me in thanking our speakers, Izumi Nakamitsu, Patricia Lewis, and Chris King. Thank you all for helping us understand some of these issues, and especially the point made by the Undersecretary General at the beginning and ending with where Chris just ended, that it is important to remember where we've started and where we've come from, but the imperative of turning our face urgently to the task of the present and what can be done meaningfully given the situation that we actually confront today, and the capacity that we have to actually take action is maybe much larger than we may think. And it's not just those who appear to have great power in the world that can take action, but that action is open to many, many other people, including civil society actors and individuals throughout the world. So with that, again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Patricia. And Thank you, Chris Rostampour, the Policy and Communications Manager for the Physicists Coalition, who set up the webinar and has made our conversation today possible. And so on behalf of the Physicists Coalition, let me thank you all for joining our discussion today. And I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So thank you, everyone.